welcome to the 15 Red podcast on live on Facebook, and will be episode on YouTube afterwards as well. So this is episode 28, I think I'm right.
29.
29. Oh, 29. Get the host. Yeah, tell the host off, Mike. Thank you very much. And a good morning to you, Mike. I'm going to go to Scott first just for that. Scott, good evening to you, Scott.
Good evening, Drew. Very good evening to you. Can you turn yourself up at all, Drew? You're very low.
Low? What's going on here? Is that better?
Yes, that's better now. You're.
Oh, cool. My phone updated earlier and it's gone a bit squirrels. So it's yes, good evening, Scott. Hope you're well, and good news about the churches in Ireland.
Yes, we're due to come back on the 26th, God willing. That'll be good, just before Easter.
That's excellent stuff. And good morning to you, Mike. How are you, sir? You okay?
Fantastic, yeah.
Excellent stuff. So we've got a special guest on tonight in a little while called Marcus. He's Marcus Stead, a Welsh journalism from Snooker. He's coming up very, very shortly. But first, tell us about the Pro Series at the minute, Scott.
Well, we've got. If I just minimize our room for a moment, I can go and have a look. If you just bear with me.
No problem.
The Pro Series.
So, Mike, any other news to tell us about? Have you picked up on any other news today?
No, just Alex Higgins' birthday today. Would have been 72.
He's 22, yeah. Yeah. Happy birthday to Alex Higgins. There you go. That's where you go. So, yeah, it's his
No, well, I've got the Pro Series stuff now.
Okay.
Kyron Wilson and Ben Williston are in the top two places in the group to go through to the final stage.
Okay.
Followed by Stuart Carrington, Zhou Guodong, Robert Wilkins, Zhou Zhentong, Lu Ning, and finally Sean Murphy.
That sounds like a good line. Sounds like a great lineup tonight, that does.
Oh, dear.
All them players, and suddenly Sean Murphy comes out. Dear me, Scott. That's in the second round group, isn't it?
Yeah, that's in the second stage.
Yes.
So there's 4 groups in the second stage, and the winners of these 4 groups and the runners-up will participate in the final group to determine who wins the thing.
Who's going to win the thing? Sean Murphy?
Unlikely, probably Trump, I would say.
Yeah. Do we think is Ronnie in it at the minute?
No, well, he finished bottom of his group, remember?
He did.
Do you remember he got docked a frame for turning up late?
Sorry, how thoughtful of me. Ron is not in it anymore, is he? No, sorry, that's really bad. Alex Higgins, just going back to Alex Higgins, by the way, he actually shares the same birthday as my brother, because it's Chris Drayton's birthday, my brother, today as well. Shares the same birthday. And he's 2 days off me, which I'm on Saturday. So
wow.
By the way, I won't be here on Saturday as it's my birthday, just to let you know.
Oh, yeah.
What was that, Graham?
I won't be here on Saturday, Scott, as it's my birthday, so we always get our birthday night off.
Oh, yeah.
I'm on my own then.
Don't worry, Scott, I'll help you out.
No, I'm sure Michael will be there.
Right.
Give him good support. Wow. So who do you think's going to win tonight then, Scott? Who's your picks for tonight?
Probably Kyron and Ben, I would think.
And Sean, obviously. I think.
No, Sean's in 8th. There aren't enough matches left for him to be top.
Well, you know, I wonder.
Although, to be fair to Sean, as I was saying to Michael here, he does live in the Republic of Ireland. Having to travel between there and England means he's got to quarantine every time he comes back.
That's true, yeah. But I was just going to say that he's bottom of the group.
Yeah, I mean, maybe if he was like third, that might be better. But the fact he's bottom is a shock.
He's only won one game. Which top 16 player is more likely for a World Championship exit? Sean Murphy.
I know, it's possible. Yeah.
You seem to be finding it very funny, Graham.
This is the way that you said Sean Murphy. And Mike's reaction, I got me, I think. Sorry. Anyway.
Yeah, but can I say a word on Alex being from Northern Ireland, of course?
Of course, yes.
Well, let's just say one of the more colourful characters to come out of our province.
Yes, he was. He was a good showman, wasn't he?
He was. I remember when he died, he said to his sisters, or when he was in his final illness, he says, "You'll have some bother to sort out when I go, because I want to make a funeral with George Best."
Yeah, and that 69 break, because not just because of the 69 break and the way he did it in the semis, but it still remains the best break seen at the Crucible.
The best and the worst.
And the worst, yeah, because he was out of his cue ball was all over the shop.
Yeah, because if you were sitting a youngster down and trying to teach them cue ball control, don't put that break on.
No, that's right. You wouldn't teach them that.
No.
Anyway, shall we get our guest on? Are we ready?
Yes, we await our special guest with bated breath.
Here we go. Marcus. What's his name? Call. So he's called, and hopefully he should be coming on in a moment.
This is live broadcasting, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, can't beat it, can we?
No.
You can't beat it at all. So I just want to say thank you very much last night, guys, for a very good episode. I thought that was good. Good content, yet again.
Yeah, sorry we locked you out, Graham, but
Don't worry about it.
time was against us.
Very informative episode that was last night, guys. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And you do carry it off quite well. So here
we go.
Well, as long as the picture's there.
It's loading.
Live television, of course. anything can go wrong.
It kind of sums up. Oh, there we go.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear us, Marcus?
I can just about hear you. Let me check the mic. How well can you hear me?
Very well, thank you.
Okay, because I can't tell from here whether it's my webcam microphone or my main radio type microphone. If the sound quality is very good indeed, then I know that my radio microphone is working, but it's hard to tell at the moment. So, am I sounding tinny or am I sounding clear?
Yes, we can hear you all right.
I can hear you fine.
Okay. I'm guessing in that case it's this microphone here rather than the webcam microphone. But I can't see anything that prompts me to make sure I'm using the right one.
Okay. Yeah,
That's all right.
Oh, yeah, I can hear.
Okay, let me just check my settings a sec. Speaker. Here we go. Speaker view. This might help. No, grid view rather. What's that there? What was that? I've never used this before.
Don't worry about it.
Right. And Device settings. What does that do? Camera, microphone. Ah, here we go. Jack mic. This is the one. How do I sound now?
Very good. That's better.
Yeah, that's good.
That's much better now.
Is this one here? See, this should be radio quality now.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
right. So,
Sorted it, guys.
Sorted it. So, thank you for joining us, Marcus, for our 50 Red podcast episode.
You're very welcome. Good to be with you guys.
Yeah, and it's nice that you came through Gaz Allen as well.
Oh yeah, he's a good friend of mine. I first met Gaz at the World Amateur Championship back in 2013 in Daugavpils in Latvia, and that was about 6 months after he lost in the European Amateur Final to Robin Hull. So Gaz has been a good friend of mine for some years now, and I thought he was fantastic when he was on your podcast last week.
He was. Very, very nice guy. Yeah, Robin Hull. You mentioned him. That's a blast from the past.
Oh yeah, Robin Hull. He was, somebody we saw at the Crucible. I think it was back in the 90s, first of all, possibly the early 2000s. And then he had certain health problems. I think at one point he was even unable to walk properly. It was due to problems with his ears. Now, I always say to people, if you think you've got problems with your balance or anything like that, first thing to check is for ear infections. And it turned out that was the case with Robin. And that held him back for quite a long time. But then he came back through. He qualified to the Crucible again, but at European amateur level, when he beat Gaz in the final. And he made a comeback of sorts, didn't he?
Yes, when he played O'Sullivan in the first round at the Crucible the year Selby beat Ronnie in the final.
That was it, yeah, that was it. I can't remember what year that was now. It was a fair few years ago, but I do remember it. Good man, you're right.
Yes, well, Scott is our statistician of the group.
He's great, good man.
Everything there is to know about him. So, first of all, Marcus, what got you into the journalism side of things? First of all, into snooker, and I know you do darts and racing as well. So
I'll tell you how my snooker journey really began. When I was a little boy, as so many of us were influenced by our parents and our grandparents and watching snooker with them. And for me, it was when I was a very young boy, a toddler. My late grandmother used to look after me fairly frequently. I mean, the first part of my life, she looked after me. Then my father gave up work. He was made redundant and looked after me full time. But my grandmother still looked after me quite a lot of the time. And it was when I was in her house in particular, this was in the days where, snooker was massive in the mid-1980s. I was born in 1983. And Steve Davis was in his pomp. And I don't know what it is, but, I mean, Gaz said something very similar to you the other day when he was on here about playing snooker with a pencil and marbles on the floor. That was what it did for him. Now, I never had that, but what I did do is watching Steve Davis and players like that in the mid-1980s. That was really the beginning of me watching snooker. I think it's the colour and the coloured balls that attracts a lot of very young children. And in that instance, watching snooker with her, and I was hooked from a very young age, and I've been with the game ever since. Now, in terms of snooker journalism, I mean, I've been writing I would say my journalism journey really began with darts, when I used to write for the old BDO World Darts Championship website in the late 90s into the early 2000s. I was still at school at that time. Then I went to the University of Liverpool, got a 2-1 degree in politics and communication studies. And then I did my NCTJ at Highbury College in Portsmouth. And I was writing books at that time. I've written a biography of Frankie Dettori, the jockey, Brian O'Driscoll, the Ireland and Lions former rugby captain, and Kevin Peterson, the former England cricket captain. And that was all written in the mid-2000s, even before I fully graduated. Well, I graduated, but I hadn't done my journalism qualification. But in terms of snooker, it was round about 2007 when I realised that, okay, David Hendon was doing a great job with the snooker scene blog round about that time, which was really gaining traction. But I thought there's a market here for a snooker website that covers results, tournaments, match reports, all that sort of thing, because there wasn't that much of it around on the internet at the time. And I thought at the time, there was, what, 6 ranking tournaments plus the Masters. Snooker was pretty much in the doldrums at that time. And I thought, okay, this is, what, a 7-8 week a year commitment. And I was trying to establish myself in journalism anyway. So supremesnooker.com was the name of the website. A friend of mine who's a web designer used that. He designed a website, I did the writing. And for about 3 or 4 years, that ran pretty well. But then Barry Hearn thankfully took control of the game. And by the way, if I think he hadn't taken control of the game, it would have been in the doldrums long before now. I think it would have died a death at some point in the early 2010s, to be honest with you. But what happened then was, for being a 7-8 week a year commitment, there was a tournament every week. And I can't work unpaid 52 weeks a year running a website, making very, very little money from it. Now, fortunately, what worked in my favour at that time is I was getting on Clive Everton's radar, and I was emailing him regularly. And then actually, we're just coming up to the 10th anniversary now. I joined Snooker Scene in June 2011. We're just coming up to the 10th anniversary of that later this year. Clive said, "Can I phone you?" Clive wanted to speak to me. He rang me up, and I remember it was about 10 o'clock one night, actually. Clive rang me up. We spent the best part of an hour just chatting and chewing the fat. And then he offered me work with Snooker Scene, and it all went from there. So just come to 10 years with them now. Guys, I've got a lot of feedback on my speakers. Talk amongst yourselves. I'm going to get some headphones. You carry on.
No problem at all. Clive Everton, Snooker Scene, Dave Hendon, who we had on the other night. It all connections there, which is great.
I can barely hear you, my friend. I'm just going to put these headphones in. Have a chat amongst yourselves a minute. I'll be back with you.
Well, just to say what Marcus was saying about the game being in the doldrums at the time. It was horrible. For the simple reason that you can't call it a proper circuit if there are only
I just
6
realised, guys,
events.
get this. I've got headphones, but I haven't got a headphone socket, so we're just going to have to persevere. I still can't work this new computer, but we'll persevere as best we can. Just be aware, I've got a bit of feedback coming back my way, but we'll carry on. Don't worry about it.
Delay then. We'll have a delay sort of thing going on. Okay, no problem at all.
All right, yeah, let's carry on. Let's carry on. Keep talking. Sorry, Scott, you were saying, yeah, carry on, mate.
Yeah, I was saying that, like, you can't call it a proper circuit with 6 ranking events.
Mm.
You know,
Well,
so
you're right. And this is something that came up the other day with David Hendon, wasn't it? When you're down to 6 ranking tournaments plus the Masters, where we were when snooker was well and truly in the doldrums in that era, that the late... Look, let me put it to you this way, guys. Right. You've had various guests on here over the course of the last few weeks, and you've got various perspectives on all that's gone on. Let's talk about Clive Everton for a minute, right? Because let's take Clive. I believe that Clive could have been an investigative journalist on Panorama or Newsnight or World in Action or any of those top-notch current affairs programs on television. He is that good a journalist. Now, Clive, since about 1966, has been exposing wrongdoing and corruption in snooker, going way back to then. And the way he summarizes it very succinctly is that snooker in its history has had 2 problems. It's either been run by players who know nothing about business or businessmen who know nothing about snooker. And that was a problem starting in the 1960s and didn't end until Barry Hearn took control of the game. And so this was a story, it was a 50-year story in effect.
yeah.
And I think, and I'm in no doubt about this, if it wasn't for Clive's efforts in exposing corruption, and I don't use that word lightly, corruption in snooker, through all that era, I believe that it would have died the death, probably in the mid to late 1990s, and again in the years immediately before Barry Hearn took control of the game. So I think hats off to Clive. The well from which we are drinking today, and the players, the managers, the journalists, everyone working in snooker in any capacity owes Clive a huge debt of gratitude for the work that he has done. And if you want a blow-by-blow account, for crying out loud, buy Black Farce and Cue Ball Wizards, his book, because he goes through it meticulously, painful detail at some times. It's quite something.
Yeah, I got it for Christmas, actually.
Good man. Good man.
I've met Clive Everton on one occasion. Lovely man. I can't, you know, I was in awe of him. I've got to say, when I saw him walking up to her, I was like, "That's Clive Everton! Oh my God!" But yeah, the guy is an absolute legend. And like you say, if you know, the game would have died pretty much without him, wouldn't it? Like you said him, you said message here. The game would have virtually gone to the dogs.
I'm in no doubt about that. I mean, I think, let's think about it now. Right. Let's take the year Steve Davis beat the late Doug Mountjoy to win his first world title. The money Steve Davis made that year upon winning the World Championship, it was a comparable prize fund for him to what John McEnroe got for winning Wimbledon that year.
Yeah.
When Steve Davis won his last World Championship in 1989, when he beat John Parrott in that one-sided final, Steve Davis received half of, I think it was the year Pat Cash won Wimbledon. Steve Davis's prize fund was half of what the winner of Wimbledon got. So it was comparable to John McEnroe when he won his first in 81, and yet it was half what Pat Cash got, I think it was, in 89. Was it Cash or Becker? One or the other, I can't remember. But that tells you that through all those boom years in the 1980s, there was gross mismanagement going on in snooker, in terms of the sort of people that were running it, the sort of people who were running the WPBSA, the way my late friend Mike Watterson, who took the World Championship to the Crucible in 1977, and by the way, we're just past the second anniversary of Mike's death. I'm sorry he's not around now. He'd have made a wonderful guest for you guys, because Mike was a good friend to me. I used to love chatting to Mike over the phone, and God, the stories he could have told you guys would be unbelievable. But Mike was frozen out of the game by 83. The people in charge of snooker, and Clive, you know, Clive's vision for snooker scene has always been it's a mixture of the wisdom cricketer and private eye. So you've got the element of it that's a record of what's going on as a journal of who beat who and match reports and all that, and every result going, and the investigative element, which he based entirely on private eye. And Clive, month by month, year by year, he was exposing court case. Look, Clive has had 20 court cases with the WPBSA. 20 court cases. He has won every single one.
Yeah.
So if Clive Everton tells you the moon is made of cheese, for crying out loud, believe him. Because Clive, in all the years that snooker scene has run, only once has the magazine ever had to apologise for getting something badly wrong. Clive tells you everything. Look, he's been called every name under the sun.
Yeah.
Look, his battles with Rex Williams were legendary. I mean, they crossed the courtroom more than once. If Clive, his integrity is absolutely spot on, and without him, there would be no professional snooker in the way we know it now. Of that, there's no doubt in my mind.
Of course. Like, guys, Mike and Graham are saying this too. If you haven't read that book, Black Farce and Cue Ball Wizards, read it, because while it's good, it is painful to know some of the battles that Clive went through to try and get the game properly run.
Oh, absolutely. You're spot on, because, look, let's think about it now. Going back to the 1960s and the first ever match fixing scandal, in effect, which was on ATV in the Midlands. There was a tournament, and it was involved with Jack Carnham. And Clive had a big falling out with Jack Carnham at that time. Now, we think of Jack Carnham, you know, when he did the commentary on Cliff Thorburn's 147, good luck, mate. You look at Jack Carnham's record as an administrator. It ain't good. Read it in Black Farce and Cue Ball Wizards. Clive describes it. Jack Carnham's track record as administrator was not good. Into the 70s then, Rex Williams, Del Simmons, that went into the 1980s as well. And bit by bit, the way Mike Watterson was frozen out of the game, even though Mike was a damn good promoter. I mean, Mike was a character, but his integrity was spot on. You know, the story there is quite simple. You look at old footage of the 1976 World Snooker Championship, which was split between Wythenshawe and Middlesbrough, I think it was. They had two venues, one in Wythenshawe, one in Middlesbrough. You look at the layout of the set there. It was a working men's club. They had to get black felt to cover the windows. The seats were laid out. It was not a nice setting. And what happened was, it looked like Embassy had lost confidence in the product, if you like, and they were threatening to withdraw their sponsorship. And Mike was saying, "Oh God, it looks like we're not going to have a world championship." He'd not long got married. I think it was either just before or just after his wedding to his late wife Carol. And Carol went on a night out with her friends to the Crucible Theatre in Sheffield.
And she came home to Mike that night and said, I think I found the perfect venue for snooker. And she was full of enthusiasm. So next day, Mike went down there. He met the theatre's manager, Jack Lyman, I think his name was. And he was just walked into an empty theatre and he thought, wow, look at this. This is quite something. And he, Jack Lyman said to him, Mike, I don't think there's quite enough room here for 2 tables. But he said, don't take my word for it. Let's get a measuring tape. We got a measuring tape. Just about enough room with very little to spare for 2 tables. Mike worked 364 days a year to get the tournament there. He only had Christmas Day off. It was about building confidence, getting Embassy back on board, getting the BBC on board, securing TV coverage, and everything that was involved in it. And Mike delivered. And that was the beginning of it. So that was 1977. Later that year, he created the UK Championship from scratch. Within a few years from that, he created the British Open, the International Open, and the World Cup of Snooker. So he created, with the exception of the Masters, which was created by Clive Everton and Peter West. Clive created the Masters, by the way. But it was, with the exception of the Masters, Mike effectively created the modern snooker tour. And yet, Rex Williams got jealous, and Del Simmons got jealous, and certain others got jealous. And Mike always said to me, whenever he missed a WPBSA meeting, he found they'd taken another tournament off him. By 1983, he was frozen out of the game. And that, what should have been, I just gave a comparison of Steve Davis's prize money in 81 and 89. There were gross opportunities missed there to grow the game financially and keep it on a good footing. And I'm afraid Clive, credit to him, without him exposing them, kaput. It would have gone down the pan.
Interesting.
Like, it is so difficult for modern fans to realise that. But we were literally on the edge of eternity in relation to snooker. We were literally on the edge of hell. I would.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a true eye opener you give us there, Marcus. Absolute eye opener.
It is, yeah, because you look back to that era, and let's not forget now, it wasn't that many years ago. I mean, I talked about when I ran the SupremeSnooker.com website in the late 2000s. Let's be honest, it was rubbish at that time, professional snooker, compared to now. Look, the standard of the play was fantastic, and still is. But in terms of, we go 2 months without a tournament in the middle of winter. I mean, this was crazy stuff. You know, one of the things I remember Barry Hearn and I were emailing each other not long after he took over the game, and because Barry asked for my help in terms of finding the Welsh Open a venue, because he knew that it would be more marketable in Cardiff than in Newport, because Cardiff is a capital city where I live. I'm in Cardiff Bay right now. And what Barry said to me, you know, I need a venue and so forth. And I said, if you go to the CIA, what we now call a Motor Point Arena, they're probably going to have is going to be a similar problem to the Wembley Arena with the Masters, in that the Masters left the Wembley Conference Centre, which was a legendary venue. They had to leave there because it was demolished, and they moved to the Wembley Arena. Now, the trouble was the Wembley Arena was too big for snooker, because realistically with snooker, you can only fit a maximum of about 2,000 people around the table. 2,000 fans. And I said, look, you're going to have a similar problem. The Welsh Open has been staged at the CIA before. And it's just too big. It wasn't very welcoming. And Barry Hearn took my point. He said, where else in Cardiff or near Cardiff can you recommend? I gave him a few ideas. But then Barry Hearn had the idea, him and Jason Ferguson had the idea, not a 32-man tournament anymore. It's 128-man tournament, or player tournament, because women are involved as well, of course. But then it's a multi-table format. Therefore, the Motor Point Arena, the CIA Motor Point, is suddenly an ideal place, because you've got multi-table for most of the week, down to one table for the final. Hey presto, problem solved. So he did take it to the Motor Point, and rightly so, because he expanded the format. Now, compare that, right? You just brought back a memory there. When it was previously there, in the late 90s, early 2000s, this was in Rex Williams' second time as chairman. It was a 32-man tournament. And then 1 year, he had to cut it to a 16-man tournament. Do you guys remember why?
I don't.
All right, I will remind you. They went to book the venue, and they left it so late to book the CIA, as it then was, that a caravan exhibition had been booked for the first 3 days. So Rex's idea for that was to just cut the tournament in half and make it a 16-man ranking tournament in that era. That's how loopy snooker was at that time. So it was a regular 32-man tournament. Who won it that year? Now, I always used to go, I was still young at the time, I was still at school. I was there when Mark Williams beat Stephen Hendry in the final. Was that the year, now I'm wondering, that John Higgins beat Stephen Lee 10-9 in the final? Because I was in the audience that night.
2000, that would have been.
Or was it the year Paul Hunter? It could have been. Sorry, carry on, mate.
Yeah, well, it could have been 2000 if John beat Stephen Lee then.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I just try to remember. Was that the year it was cut to 16 men because there was a caravan exhibition there for the first 3 days?
I think it must have been because Paul played 5 matches to win in '98.
All right, yeah, you're right. And I was also there for the 2 years in a row where it was Paul against Ken in the final.
Yeah, 01 and
that was later on.
wasn't it?
Yeah, you're right. It was. Hang on. Yeah, I was there for both of those. You're quite right. And I remember when Ken won it, the evening session was very short. And in those days, unlike now, if you have a short evening session, they sort of revive Big Break or put something on for you. They did nothing for us that night.
No.
Big Break.
Sorry, gents, I'm sort of dominating the conversation here. Why don't you two come back in?
So, if you're in charge of snooker now, what changes would you make?
Right, that's a good question. Now, I'm going to take a slightly different view to my friend and colleague David Hendon on this, because David was saying the other night, wasn't he, that he was all in favour of snooker effectively being an all-year-round thing, like golf and tennis. I favour a summer break. Now, I know Ian Doyle agrees with me, because Ian wrote a letter to Snooker Scene, former promoter Ian Doyle wrote a letter to Snooker Scene saying that's the one change he would make. And Ian wrote that letter 7-8 years ago. And it's a view I share, because I think after the World Championship, we're almost back to Q school straight away, aren't we? It seems that way. There's no doubt. I would favour a summer break, a decent summer break after the World Championship, because having the contacts that I do and having the sort of conversations I have, one thing that really struck me in that era when Barry Hearn immediately took over the game in that few-year period was that players were suddenly going from being away from home half a dozen times a year, and bear in mind, if they're knocked out early on, they're back home within a few days, to being on the road 48, 49 weeks a year, it seems now. And that took its toll, and this doesn't get talked about enough. It took its toll on their relationships, on the amount they get to see of their children, and their overall well-being. And, you know, I'm not going to name names on this, but I'm aware of certain wives in snooker that were saying, hang on, when I married you, this wasn't what I signed up for, you being away 48 weeks a year. So in terms of watching your children grow up, that's an important part of life as well, and having a balance is an important part of life. Yeah. But also in terms of, look, you had Gareth Allen on here the other day, and you've had other players, I'm guessing, have said similar things. That it sounds glamorous, but when you're in an airport, you're flying out to wherever, you play one match on not a TV table, you've lost it, you're back in the airport, you're flying home, and you haven't made any money. That, one, it costs you a fortune, and two, it's not actually a very glamorous life at all. You get to see lots of departure lounges, you eat lots of supermarket sandwiches, and you spend a lot of time in hotel rooms. So I think the one change I would make, a decent summer break after the World Championship. That's the one thing I would say, because, look, things we all like in life, whether it's Sunday dinner is wonderful, having sex is wonderful, but you don't want to do it all the time. You know, it's some things are best rationed, aren't they?
Now, Barrett was on about that when we had him as a guest the other night, and Gareth Allen obviously mentioned it too. That at Q School, when they go there, it's an absolute grind. It's a graft, because you know they have to pay to join it. They have to pay to get there, and they're there for about 15 hours something, and it's just you know, like they say, it's an absolute graft down there. It's hard work.
It is.
And when Ronnie said what he said about, you know, having to lose an arm and a leg to drop out the top 32, Jamie Barrett said, well, I'd love him to step into my shoes and just see how hard at work it is.
Well, the thing about Q School, and I wrote a piece about this when Gaz dropped off the tour for the last time, and I knew that Gaz, he gave Q School one more go, and then he said, right, that's it. And actually, I think Gaz did the right thing, because he's now an Airbus apprentice. In fact, I wrote his reference for that. And he's making the most of it. So let's take Gaz as an example. Right? I wrote this in Snooker Scene, it's not a secret. His family has spent somewhere in the region of £100,000 supporting him in snooker through the period of 2 decades. We're talking, his grandparents and everything like that. His late grandfather now sadly passed on when he was on the tour. They supported him to the hilt. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. That £100,000 was spent over a long period of time, but nevertheless, it is a lot of money. And he fell off the tour for the last time, and he got this up because he's into aeroplanes anyway. It's a big passion of his. He got this opportunity with Airbus. Let's look at where he is now. What, 2-3 years later, I think we're on now. He's got his own house with his girlfriend. Another year or two, he'll have finished his apprenticeship. He'll have a stable job, a skilled job as well, and a stable job. He's at an age now where he'll want the things most people want from life as they get a little bit older, in terms of children. I'm guessing marriage might be on the cards a few years from now. I'm afraid being a low-ranked professional snooker player will not let you have that, because the money you make is very low. Once I would say beyond about 64 in the world, everyone below that is struggling in terms of not making a decent enough income. You can do it for a few years. You can just about get by for a few years. But in terms of you want the things, house, car, decent pension, children, everything like that, in terms of stability, being a low-ranked snooker player will not give you that.
Yeah.
And Gaz, I think, himself has made a good decision.
So what, like Mike said about what changes would you make to snooker, what changes would you make to Q School or the lower rank players?
Well, that's a complicated question, isn't it? Because Q School is expensive, and it's expensive for a reason. Because if it was cheap, we'd all be doing it. And you've got to make it expensive, because we'd all quite like the idea of, let's say it was 50 quid to go to Q School. We'd all play it in the hope of, somebody who's fallen off the tour, somebody we watched on telly, just having a mischievous game against them. So it's expensive for a reason. But I think back to how things used to be. It used to be the winner of the Welsh Amateur Championship would get on the tour. As winner of that, the winner of the English Amateur Championship would get on the tour. Now, those days are gone now, and they're long gone. And we've had various incentives, people setting up tournaments where the prizes are placed in Q School, and they pay your Q School fee if you win their tournament. We had the Snooker Backer Classic was like that a few years ago. Now, how would I change Q School? It's brutal, isn't it? It is brutal, Q School. But what we do see a lot of, I'm afraid, is the same names coming through every year. There's people, they drop off, they come straight back on, they drop off, they come on again. And, a guy I know pretty well, Kishan Hirani, for example, he got a 2-year card on Q School. I was delighted for him. And then he gave Q School one more go. And then he messaged me last summer and said, right, that's it now. Now, Kishan, to be fair, he's got a good grounding in business. And I know business, stuff like that, is a passion of his anyway. So he'll be all right in life. But it's just I just find Q School very, very brutal, is what I'm saying. I don't necessarily have all the answers, but it is very, very harsh, is what I'm saying.
You're right about the...
But can I just ask, Marcus?
We need to see a bit of refreshing characters coming through, don't we? It would be nice.
Yeah, but
Go on, Scott, carry on. Sorry, did you want to say something?
Oh, sorry, Marcus. I just wanted to ask, when would you start the season ideally if you did take a summer break?
Right, that's a difficult question to answer, because, look, in terms of when I was a kid, I think some of my happiest memories of watching snooker was afternoons, maybe in my grandmother's house, rain lashing down. I think there's something particularly cozy about watching snooker with the fire on, grey afternoons. There's something good about that and something very cozy. However, the World Championship, when it comes around in the spring, that brings its own joys to me, because even if it's raining on an April day, I think, the nice evenings are coming now. We can get the barbecue out soon and what have you. And I'm a pescatarian, I don't eat meat, but, that sort of barbecue time is coming, and the nicer weather is coming. I would say, let's have August off. That's how I would put it. Let's have August off. And then start afresh in September. Let the players spend time with their wife and children, have some family time. Let's the rest of us focus on the cricket and the tennis and all that sort of thing, and the Olympics and that. Because, like I say, all right, I'll be straight with you. David Hendon said the same thing to you the other day. I'm looking at the results of this pro series that's going on this week. I'm not sitting through every ball of it. I've got to be honest. I'm having a little break this week to indulge in my other interests. And actually, I'm helping to put next month's snooker scene back on as well, because I'm doing stuff for April snooker scene. The deadline is quite close now for that. But I'm just focusing on other things this week. And I think that little break it does you good, doesn't it?
It does.
Absolutely.
I agree. Totally agree. Yeah.
So how do you perceive the media's coverage of snooker now compared to back then?
Right. This is a mixed bag, and it's a good question you ask, because before my time, there was a time in the 1980s where every national newspaper in Britain had a snooker correspondent. These days, the press room is a very different place, because you think now that the 80s, people of a certain generation before my time, Tony Stenson in the Mirror, for example, Clive Everton working for the Guardian and the Independent, Phil Yates at the Times, John Dee, the late John Dee, you had Tex Henderson, Trevor Baxter. The press room used to be full. Every national newspaper had a snooker correspondent. Today, it's been cut to the bone. You get what Hector Nunn's doing the work for the papers owned by Reach PLC. So Hector will cover the Mirror, the Express, and the People. But beyond that, there is not that much snooker in the national newspapers. Now, I'll give credit to the Metro paper. They got Nick Metcalf and Phil Haig. Do give snooker a good shout in the Metro, but they're very often not at the tournament. They don't get sent to the tournament. But this is a symptom of the times we live in more broadly. It's not just snooker that gets a bad press in that sense. Papers are being cut to the bone because circulation is declining year on year. Every national newspaper has got annual declines of 7, 8, 9, 10% bare minimum. Local newspapers are in even bigger trouble. Big problem you've got. The under 45s are not in the habit of buying a paper. They're not in a habit of paying for news. And therefore, that has consequences in terms of how much money is invested in newspapers. Because, fewer people read it. Therefore, you charge less for your advertising. And also, you've got fewer people actually paying for the physical copy. So you're being hit by a double whammy. You're charging less for your advert. You're charging less. You're not making as much money from people physically buying it. Therefore, that has consequences, and that's why newspapers are in a state of decline to the extent that there are. It's not just snooker that's been affected by this, but I will say this. There's an anti-snooker snobbery among many sports editors on many national newspapers. You go to them with a snooker story, they're not interested. Now, let's look at the fact here. Eurosport viewing figures are very good. ITV, I can tell you, are delighted with what the viewing figures ITV4 gets for the snooker tournaments they cover. The World Grand Prix, the Players' Championship, the Tour Championship, and the Champion of Champions. They are delighted with it. They have made that investment in snooker for a reason. BBC's a funny one, isn't it? Because they give snooker all these hours of attention, and they cover it better than they have done in the past. David Hendon talked about the other day. The compromises that are made in terms of we don't get to see the evening sessions in full and all that. But BBC are giving it plenty of hours. But come Sports Personality of the Year, they give it about 7 seconds most years. They'll show it, but they won't be proud of it, is what I'm saying at the BBC. So in terms of, I contact the sports editor, I say, I've got a snooker story for you. They usually don't want to know. And there's an anti-snooker snobbery out there that the public, the British public, the world public, they love their snooker.
Yeah.
The newspaper editors, there's this snobbery there, and it starts as the same thing. There's a snobbery. They're reluctant to give it the column inches it deserves. And that is something, Clive's been battling that for donkey's years. I'm battling it now. But it's similarly, right? You watch, it's a Sunday night, tournament's finished. You put the BBC News channel on or Sky News on, and they have the sports bulletins. They'll tell you all about the Premier League rugby, Six Nations rugby, Premier League football. They'll tell you how the cricket's going. Unless it's the World Championship, they won't tell you the results of the snooker tournament that just finished on a Sunday night. How much would it take to say, in snooker, Judd Trump has beaten Neil Robertson 9-6 to win for whatever earlier this evening? They won't do it. And that's snobbery as well. So we're up against it in that sense, yeah.
And why do you think that is?
I think it's to do with the sort of people that work in these sorts of environments. Now, to take right, let's take the BBC for example. Right, there's something going on here that doesn't get talked about very much. I'll ask you all. Let's see if any of you know who produces the BBC snooker coverage.
IMG.
Correct. Now you're almost right. Do you want to have a go? Anyone else want to have a go to answer it fully?
No, I thought that was a bit of a trick question there, Marcus. But...
Okay, right. The answer specifically is IMG Scotland. Now, IMG is this huge multinational, right? It's a massive company based in New York. They created a subsidiary called IMG Scotland. I can tell you that it's a tiny office with just one person working in it, right? This is true. What happens there is the BBC has got a quota system in place. I think it's something like 25% of all BBC programming has to be made by independent production companies in terms of hours and something like, I can't remember the exact percentage, but something like 15-20% has to be made in the nations and regions. So they created this subsidiary called IMG Scotland to say, look, we're meeting our quota of 15-20%, whatever it is, of broadcast hours on BBC Two are made outside of London. Look, they're made by IMG Scotland. The fact that it's one office in Glasgow with one person there means they can still tick that box. However, there's another thing going on here. After the late night highlights are finished on BBC Two, we have Snooker Extra. Now, there is no great appetite to watch matches from 5-6 hours ago at 1, 2, 3 in the morning. That is another way of the BBC making up their quota of broadcast hours made by independent production companies and in the nations and regions. And the same thing happened with the World Bowls Championship, which is made by Sunset and Vine, which is a Welsh company based in Llanelli, part of a company called Tinopolis. They created Sunset and Vine Scotland. Same thing. In fact, their office is just around the corner from IMG Scotland's office. Box ticket.
Yeah.
Okay.
I see.
Yeah.
So to change the subject, like, I know you're talking about BBC. I'm going to just veer off of snooker for a moment, but I'm very curious for your opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Have the BBC failed in their duty to report and inform the public before, during, and after the pandemic?
Right. This is a very big question. It's a very complicated question. I think what the BBC has done in terms of its news coverage is that they've moved away from straightforward fact and analysis. They insert far too much opinion in their news report. Just give me the facts and the analysis. That's all I want from the news leader and the reporter. Adjectives should always be treated with suspicion because, it's a terrible list or whatever. No, I'll decide if it's terrible. You just tell me what's happened here, please.
Exactly.
In terms of that, I think the BBC has moved away from its core duty. But the thing about the BBC, and this actually does relate to their snooker coverage as well, in the way they treat snooker, is the BBC is a goldfish bowl. And I've worked in that goldfish bowl. They're very middle-class, metropolitan, fairly elitist. They recruit from their own goldfish bowl, and this applies to their news coverage, and it applies to their attitude to snooker. Because that's why they have this slightly disparaging attitude towards snooker. But in terms of news coverage, it's like the whole Brexit thing. Now, I'm very pro-Brexit. I'm an anti-EU campaigner, have been for donkey's years. Since I was still at school, I was an anti-EU campaigner. The BBC, they reported every aspect of Project Fear as though it was fact, rather than just somebody giving their opinion. The whole thing about, the pound is going to collapse, we're going to have an emergency budget. You had Donald Tusk at the EU, World War III is going to happen. And I've actually still got recordings of old BBC news bulletins from 4 or 5 years ago in the run-up and just immediately after the referendum. It now looks embarrassingly bad because, okay, the Brexit deal is not perfect. I'm not pretending it is. You've got significant problems about Northern Ireland. But the supermarket shelves are well stacked. The traffic in Dover, the port of Dover, is now back up to 90% where it was before Brexit happened. And that's in the middle of a pandemic as well. But in terms of the pandemic, which is specifically what you asked me, just give me the facts and the analysis and let me make up my own mind. So I think in terms of not just the BBC, but the mainstream media in general, there's too much mixing up of fact and opinion. And part of it is they've got no points of reference. Like I say, they're recruiting this very narrow sphere of people. was there ever really any effort made on the BBC to go to the north of England or to go to the South Wales valleys and ask people in the pubs, in the working men's clubs, why did you vote for Brexit? Why did you do what you did there? And the answer is, there's a variety of reasons. There's no one single answer, but you may be a manual worker. A large influx of immigrant workers led to the suppression of wages. That doesn't make you a racist. You're just saying that because you've got an oversupply of cheap labour, it led to this. In many cases, it would be, globalism isn't working for them. But what it boils down to is you go to these communities, whether it's the South Wales valleys, the medium-sized towns in the north of England, life just isn't very good. They just don't see things working for them. Now, the BBC could have made a documentary or just even a simple 4 or 5 minute news report. Go there, listen to them, listen to what they have to say and understand. There wasn't anywhere near enough of that.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Good point. The point was all the media hype surrounding Brexit. I know we're going off snooker for a second, but do you think that changed people's minds on their voting, on how they voted?
I think that one of the things that happened in the run-up to the referendum was that people became more suspicious of the mainstream media. And I don't think trust in BBC News in particular has ever fully recovered from that. Because, as I mentioned Project Fear a moment ago, that became something of a national joke. Because it was, people like us could see that it was ridiculous. The pound didn't collapse. Okay, what did happen is that the morning the result was announced, and it was announced in 2016 in Leiden, the FTSE fell that day. And at lunchtime news and the evening news, BBC was saying billions of pounds have been wiped off the value of the FTSE. It's been crashing all day. By the middle of the following week, it had fully recovered. Within 3 months, it had hit 2 record highs.
Yeah.
They didn't make emphasis of that on BBC News. So if your pension is invested in the FTSE at that time, you'd have had a wobble that day, but a week later it was fully recovered. A few months later, you were higher than you were before. So I think people started to see through that. And I think what people are doing now is increasingly they're looking to alternative sources for their news, whether it's Al Jazeera. I mean, take Al Jazeera, right? Lots of reporters and presenters on there who we're familiar with who used to work elsewhere. But I watch Al Jazeera News once a day. I try to anyway. They either tell me a story I haven't heard before, or they give me a completely fresh perspective on a story I do already know, like this terrible situation in Ethiopia at the moment, where things are getting very bad indeed. Now, I watch these, I think, the BBC just didn't tell me about this. Not Ethiopia, but other stories. They just didn't tell me. So they're very selective about what they tell you and what they don't. And that I can't talk about things that are going on at the moment in relation to tragic events where legal proceedings are underway. But something happened recently where somebody was murdered in London that wasn't given as much prominence as another murder in London. And I'll leave you to work out why one and not the other. I can't talk about that any further. One of the reasons the proceedings are active. The second reason is I know the victim's mother. But I do wonder, they'll tell us all about one, but not about the other. So some tragedies are others. That's something I'm suspicious of.
Yeah, so obviously we can't go into further details more than can be said on this program anyway. We'll talk about, I just want to ask you something about darts, Marcus, as well. Why do you think there is a conflict between the BDO and the PDC?
Right. I'm very, very glad you asked me that, because I'll say it publicly now. I'm in the process of writing a book about the split in darts in the early 90s. It's a work in progress. I don't know when it's going to come out. But the story was, very briefly, this. In the mid to late 1980s, darts was everywhere, like snooker was everywhere. BBC and ITV had significant amounts of darts. 2 things happened. In 1988, ITV, when Greg Dyke, future BBC Director General, was their deputy head of sport, they got exclusive rights to the old Football League Top Flight. And they paid a lot of money for it by the standards of the day. And Greg Dyke had to make some decisions that savings had to be made elsewhere at ITV Sport. He did a few things. He ditched the old British wrestling completely, Big Daddy, Giant Haystacks and all that. He cut coverage of that, dropped a few gymnastics tournaments they were covering, and he dropped darts completely. At the same time, 1988, there's a fellow called Jonathan Martin, who used to be heavily involved in the BBC snooker coverage, and he ran snooker, darts, bowls, rugby league from BBC Manchester. That was where it was based in those days, the bosses of the coverage. Jonathan Martin, he was effectively made redundant. And Nick Hunter, the old BBC producer, the first BBC producer, their snooker coverage when they started covering the Crucible, he was made redundant as well. And what they did is that they moved all BBC Sport to London. And they announced at the same time that they were having financial issues and that darts, bowls, rugby league were being substantially cut back. So ITV had dropped it completely. BBC was left with one tournament a year, the Embassy World Championship at the Lakeside Country Club, Frimley Green, first week of January. And this situation, 1988, 89, 90, 91, 92, 1 week a year of darts on television. So that meant that apart from in the early days of BSB and Sky, very few people had Sky in those days. Sky did cover some BDO tournaments, as did the old BSB service. BSB and Sky ended up merging to create B-Sky B. Do any of you remember BSB with the old square reel dishes? It was around in the late 80s, early 90s. Because to begin with, there were two satellite services, BSB and Sky. They ended up merging within a year to create B-Sky B. But both BSB and Sky did cover some darts. But they had very, very small audiences. So for most of us who didn't have Sky in those days, 1 week a year. So in other words, you go to the Lakeside in January, you play a first round match and you lose. You have a bad day at the office. Everyone at home's watching thinking, oh, he's crap. They're not going to see you on TV for another year. So that affects your ability to make a living on the exhibition circuit. So some of the very best players in the world were losing in the first round at the Lakeside. You wouldn't see them for a year. Well, that's not sustainable. So we get to 92-ish, and the players, they formed a union called the World Darts Council. And they went to Ollie Croft, the BDO chairman, and said, look, Ollie, you can have a sort of life president role, but we want to run our own tournaments. This is not sustainable, one tournament a year. And Ollie Croft said, no, I'm not going to allow that. It's my way or the highway. I was around before TV got involved in darts. I'll be here long after it's gone. Bear in mind, the WDC group of players, they'd already, with the help of Dick Alex and the late Tommy Cox and the late Phil Jones as well, had already signed deals with regional ITV. There was a tournament on Anglia. There was a tournament on Yorkshire. There was a tournament on Tyne Tees. And they say, look, we're clearly having success here already. Let us run the whole BDO system. You can be a sort of life president. You can present the trophies and all that. And, you can turn up. But we want to run it now because you're clearly not achieving it. Thanks very much, but your time has passed. He said, no, my way or the highway. They were left for no choice but to break away. And they signed a big deal with Sky to cover the PDC. Well, the WDC became the PDC. PDC World Championship, PDC World Match Play. A few years later, the PDC World Grand Prix came along. It was Dick Alex, Tommy Cox. The story there, again, when I get this book written, and it might be a while yet, this coming, players had to remortgage their houses to get this thing up and running. And I'll give you an idea now. Right? First PDC World Championship, or WDC as it still was then, Dennis Priestley won it. He got, I think, £16,000. Following year, Phil Taylor won it. It was down to £14,000. Gerwyn Price won it this year, January. He got £500,000. That gives you an idea. And the big turning point, credit to Dick Alex and Tommy Cox and Phil Jones and people like that, when Barry Hearn came on board in about 2003-ish, I think it was, year by year then, it really grew because he created Premier League darts along the same lines as Premier League snooker. And meanwhile, the BDO limped along with Ollie Croft for years afterwards. Ollie Croft was eventually removed from the BDO. And I have to say, bearing in mind we talked a little bit earlier on about Rex Williams and Del Simmons and people like that in snooker, in terms of bad sports administration, what Des Jacklin has done at the BDO in the last 2-3 years is easily the worst I've seen in any sports governing body in all my years in journalism.
Because there was a big thing about it, I remember in 2002, 2003, where a lot of BDO players were defecting to the BDC. And the BDO didn't like it at all, did they? They were like, why are you leaving us? They didn't get it, why they were defecting.
Yeah, you're correct. There was attempts to sort of build bridges in the late 1990s where some of the best players in the BDO system were playing in the PDC World Match Play. And at that particular time, the late 90s, year-round you could play in either system. But come the World Championship, you had to make a choice. Now, Chris Mason was an example of that. I know Chris; he may even be watching this now. But he would play all year round in the PDC, and then played at the Lakeside for their World Championship. I think Chris went PDC, BDO, then back to the PDC again. But there was an example in the late 90s when, I think it was 98, 99-ish, there was a World Match Play final between Rod Harrington and Ronnie Baxter.
Yeah,
and Ronnie
98
Baxter,
that was.
sorry, mate?
98 that was.
98. Okay, thank you for that. You're right. I'm sure you're right. But what happened was, Rod came onto the stage in Blackpool for that final. Roddy came on first, then Rod came onto the stage, and a PDC official winked at Rod as if to say, for crying out loud, beat this man tonight. It will be very, very bad press for us if Roddy Baxter wins it. Sure enough, Rod did win it. But you're right, what you say about what happened in the early 2000s, when the PDC went on a sort of spending spree, bringing the best of the BDO over. Ronnie Baxter then went full-time PDC, Wayne Mardle went full-time PDC, Chris Mason went full-time PDC. About 3 or 4 years after that, Barney was the big one, getting Barney over after he'd won, he'd lost to Yella Classen in the Lakeside final, hadn't he? And he moved straight over to the PDC and played in the Premier League. And also Mervyn King around about that time moved over as well. So that was the big thing. But in terms of, it was clear. Barry Hearn could make them all good offers at that time. But in terms of the BDO effectively became more of a developmental system at that time, because you think about the BDO World Champions in the years that followed, whether it's Yella Classen or Mark Webster, Gary Anderson even, they all switched to the PDC within a few years of that. Sorry, the other two fellas I can hear quite loudly. You're quite quiet, so if you'd like to speak up a bit.
Oh, sorry, yeah. Is that better?
No, but carry on, do your best.
Martin Adams didn't defect, did he?
Martin Adams was the big one who never did. He always stayed in the BDO system. He played in the PDC World Match Play a few times, and he also played in the Grand Slam fairly recently, not that many years ago. Because he said for years and years, stop inviting me to the Grand Slam of darts, I don't want to play in it. In the end, I think he needed the money after his divorce, to be honest, and he did end up playing in the Grand Slam. But yeah, Martin Adams was the one who never tested himself properly in the PDC system. And I think that is a great shame. I mean, if you were to say to me, would Phil Taylor have won as many world titles if he did, if darts was united? And I think that is a big question. I pretty much say yes, he would, because he was that good for the 90s and 2000s and into the early 2010s. I think the one player who could have challenged him, the year Richie Burnett won at the Lakeside, and who did he beat in the final? Was it Steve Beaton, I think it was? I think Richie at that time, I think, was very strong indeed and could have given Phil a run for his money.
It was Barney, wasn't it? It was Barney that Richie beat.
Thank you. You're right. Yeah, you're quite right. Steve Beaton won it in 96, wasn't it? I think. Anyway, carry on.
95 it was.
You're bloody good at this stuff, aren't you? You can throw stats at me like anyone's business.
Yeah.
So we have to put up with this every night, Marcus.
He's a great man. He's a great man.
He is. He is. Mike, Mike's got another question for you, I'm sure, about snooker.
Yeah, no, we were thinking with the World Championship coming up, who do you like going into this year's event?
Who do I what? Sorry.
Who do you fancy to win the World Championship this year in snooker?
Do you know what I'd like to see more than anything? I'm not allowed favourites in my game because I've got to be totally impartial when I'm working. But what I would say, I want a good final this year. I think that we could do with that, can't we? I don't want a runaway final. And I'm optimistic we're going to get a good final. In 2018, the final then, when Mark Williams won it against John Higgins, I think that in terms of a final was the best. Because, everyone talks about 85 and that final frame in 85. And look, I was too young to appreciate it in 85, but I've sat through that final frame more than once. But the actual standard of the match as a final was not a classic. 2018 was a classic in all sorts of ways. And it was a wonderful final. I always remember, as I say, I mentioned Mike Watterson to you earlier on, and he and I spoke on the phone about 2 or 3 days later, and he said that was the greatest final he had ever seen. And for him to say that, the man who took it to the people, was quite something. But in terms of this year now, I think there's an interesting dynamic, isn't there? Because you've got the way Judd Trump is winning a lot, but not winning everything. I mean, he's winning as much as you would expect. No one's going to win every tournament. But the way Judd Trump has really stamped his authority on the game this year. Ronnie, well, you never know which version of him is going to turn up from one day to the next, and that's always a thing. You know, think what happened the other day. Bottom of his Pro Series group. He finished bottom of that group.
Yeah.
Now, this is a guy who goes around calling people numpties. Well, 5 of them beat him the other day. You know, so this is the reality of where we are. But the thing is, David Hendon made a good point the other day, and I think this is worth focusing on. There are crucible players and there are non-crucible players. And you think now, over the years, someone like Graham Dott, who won it in 2006,
Yep.
he adapted to the crucible final. And again, runner-up Neil Robertson 2010, remember that very well as well. He seems to like the crucible format more than most. Graham Dott, for example. Now, I'm not saying I think his best days are behind him, but he's an example of what I'm saying. Ali Carter is another one. Seems to handle the crucible better than most. So it's always players like that. I'm not saying those are the 2 I've got in mind particularly for this year, but I'm saying there's certain players who know how to handle the crucible format. And I think one of the big things about the modern era is that, with the exception of the Tour Championship, there are not that many long format tournaments around now. And I think that favours the experienced players who've seen it all and done it all and can remember the 90s where there were a few tournaments that, you know, we're used to so many best of 7 type events now. And, you know, World Championship round 1, 1st to 10. Well, wow, that's a huge challenge for a player who's never done it before or been put in that situation before. So I think there are crucible players and non-crucible players. There are also players who are just not used to it. So we're in an interesting dynamic because, okay, Judd Trump never been better than he is now. Totally different player to the one he was a decade ago. We used to use that phrase, naughty snooker. Well, he's toned that down. He's become a much more rounded player, and that's really bringing its rewards. Neil Robertson, I think there's a player who should have more than 1 world title to his name. I really do. In terms of his overall status, you know, with 11 years on now, time he won another one. Beyond that, okay, this year, interesting things have happened, haven't they? Yan Bingtao at the Masters. Again, the maturity in that man from winning the World Amateur in India in 2014, coming through and adapting. But also, I know, one of my favourite memories of snooker was when I was in Daugavpils, Latvia in 2013. The World Amateur final then was 15-year-old Zhu Yulong against 16-year-old Zhao Xingtong. And I remember Rob Spencer, who was refereeing, came up to me afterwards and he said, first of all, he said, couldn't speak a word of English at the time, those 2 lads. But he said they were a pleasure to referee because they had such good etiquette and good attitude. Now, those 2 have well and truly adapted to the demands of the professional game better than some do in the amateur ranks. Because one of the things, okay, you read my stuff in Snooker Scene, or at least I hope you do, the tournament winners page that I put together. And now I've got 10 years of experience in this. What's interesting for me is who adapts to the demands of the professional game and who doesn't. And the one who's come through the British system, if you like, and has adapted is Kyron Wilson.
Yeah.
Others who I thought would have broken through in a big way by now haven't done. And these were names that I was writing time and time again, month in, month out. How many times in about 6-7 years ago was I writing the name Shane Castle? I was writing that name in every single month. Shane Castle's won this. Shane Castle has won that. Now, when was his breakthrough? 2013. He made it to the UK Championship, didn't he? And everyone was saying he's going to go places. Okay, he's had certain problems since then, but it hasn't happened for him. Beyond that, I think about, he's a friend of mine. This is not a personal insult by any stretch of the imagination. I was writing Dwayne Jones's name a hell of a lot when I first started the snooker scene. Dwayne Jones in this, that, and the other in Wales. Now, credit to him. He fell off the tour, got back on again. And, you know, I'm not knocking him on a personal level. I like him as a bloke. He is a friend of mine. But we're not, apart from that one run he had in Germany where he reached the semi-final of the German Masters, he's not doing it consistently. And Dwayne is one of those players. I've seen him practice. I sat and watched him practice once when we were in Daugavpils in Latvia that time. And I thought, watched him practice, how does this guy ever lose? But in a match situation, it's a different thing. So I'm not writing him off. It may well still happen for him at some point. But again, you think now, other names I've written in snooker scene who are just doing very well, particularly at English amateur level or Republic of Ireland amateur level. It just making that step up is hard. So in terms of the Crucible, to go back to your original question, there could be a surprise package. Look, the one name that I'm wondering about now is Ding, because Ding can't beat Ronnie. He's had so many chances to beat him, and it hasn't happened. I think Ding made a mistake about 5 years ago, because have you guys ever interviewed Nick Barrow?
Not yet.
Yeah.
Right, there's a guy you want to get on your program, Nick Barrow. He's former professional, lives in Milton Keynes, was in the top 100 in the world. Now, Nick, a good solid journeyman professional in the 90s, but what he does now, he helps people with their psychology, and he worked with Ding.
Yeah.
Now, Nick, go to Nick, and you don't have to be mentally unwell or anything like that, but he teaches people to make the most of the talent they have. It's like, he says to me, and I interviewed him about this, and I wrote an article about it. When people say they've got depression, now we hear a lot about mental health, and I'm glad we take it seriously these days, because it's a very serious matter. And I'm glad that certain snooker players are talking about their struggles. But he says, well, point one, a lot of people who have got, say they're depressed are actually alcoholics. Well, alcohol is a depressant, so that won't help you. But he says 5 things to people who say they're depressed. Cut sugar out of your diet, work like mad, surround yourself with 2 to 3 positive people, 3 to 4 positive people, exercise rigorously 2 to 3 times a week, and develop a purpose for living that is greater than yourself. And he relates this to himself. He had certain issues. His then partner made him go and see a doctor about 8, 9 years ago. And what Nick does, he helps people in that sense, with the psychological things, you know, trying to avoid getting them on pills, if you like, because once you're on those pills, it's very hard to get off them. But also, he helped snooker players, and he helped Ding, and he worked very closely with Ding. And do you remember that period? It would have been about 8, 9 years ago now, when Ding won 3 tournaments in a row.
Yeah.
I can't remember what those tournaments were. Ding went through a very good phase when he was working with Nick, because Nick says Ding is a far greater player than Nick will ever be, or ever has been. But what he was doing with Ding is reminding him of things he already knows and getting him into good habits. Just reminding him of what he already knows, getting him into good habits. And then what happened was Ding's management changed. He changed management stables. These new people didn't want him working with Nick. And I don't think Ding has ever been quite the same player ever since, if I'm honest. Because Nick's techniques worked for Ding, and it's worked for other players as well. Ronnie O'Sullivan speaks highly of Nick. But what happened was, I'm wondering now, because I remember Nick said to me at the time that Ding has probably got about 6 or 7 years at the absolute peak to win. Now, okay, I don't necessarily agree with that, because we're seeing snooker players maturing at an older age nowadays. So I'm not writing him off yet by any means. But I'm wondering, okay, Ding has reached one final. Has he got it in him? That's one of many narratives I'm wondering about now. And I'm also wondering about players like Jordan Brown. Because again, Jordan Brown, there's a player who had 1 season on the tour years ago. He was appearing in my write-ups for Northern Ireland snooker and snooker scene, but he wasn't winning everything. You know, when I was doing my write-up on Northern Ireland snooker, the domestic tournaments there, names like Patrick Wallace were coming up. Now, Patrick has played at the Crucible, as we know. I think Patrick, is he still the only player who's made it to the quarterfinals at his sole time he qualified for the Crucible? I think
Yes, he is.
Yes, thank you. I knew you'd know that. You and Phil Yates. I just imagine how boring that conversation
was. In the quarters that year?
Go on, you're going to tell me. Go on.
Joe Swale.
Another Northern Irishman.
Yeah.
What I said about Jordan Brown there, right? What I said about Jordan Brown. When he was on the amateur circuit up until just a few years ago, when he was working in that petrol station, yes, he was winning tournaments in Northern Ireland, but he wasn't winning all of them. There was Patrick Wallace, there was Raymond Fry and players like that. But to see him come through and win the Welsh Open as whatever it was, 750 to 1 outside or whatever it was, that was a great narrative. Now I'm wondering, can he? I'm not saying how will he adapt to the Crucible format? You know, will he get there first of all? But you know, there's so much at stake, isn't there?
I think he will get there.
Sorry, Scott. I was just Dave Hendon.
Time will tell.
I hope he does. But Dave Hendon was on about Ding, saying that in this pandemic he hasn't been back to see his family, and that's affecting him.
Well, it would affect anybody, wouldn't it? Let's be honest about it. And this is one of many narratives that are around. Sorry. Yeah, you were speaking. Go on.
Probably fading off a bit because of that sole reason.
Yeah, well, you imagine it now. I mean, I always think back to when I was at university in Liverpool in the early 2000s, and there was a mature student there who was Chinese. He was in his mid-30s at the time. He hadn't seen his wife for about 2 or 3 years. And I always remember something happened to him. And you remember the SARS outbreak of 2002, 2003? China, for some reason, and we didn't have the communication then we have now in terms of this very platform or Skype or anything like that. There was nothing like that. There was your mobile phone and that was it. And the Chinese government hiked the cost of international calls at that time. And calling his wife was costing him a fortune. So you imagine that, how hard it must be to not see your wife for that length of time. And he won't be, okay, Ding's the high profile one. I bet there's lower ranked Chinese players in a similar position.
Absolutely. Totally agree with that. Totally agree. Mike had an interesting question about snooker on the radio.
Yeah, so we've been talking about this between the three of us, and we're wondering if there will ever be the day where snooker would be like a good sport to have on the radio, like tennis and golf.
Right. Let me let you into a secret. This happened before. It was in the 1930s or 40s. They covered the World Women's Final on BBC Radio. I think Thelma Carpenter or Joyce Gardner was one of the commentators. I think they've both done snooker commentary on the radio. It has been tried before back then, but there again, here's something. The very first BBC News bulletin on the radio in the 1930s, I think it was.
Okay.
They gave you the day's news in a very posh accent like this, and at the end of it, they said, now the sports news consisted of billiards results from London that night. That was on the very first BBC radio news bulletins. Now, you ask me, could snooker on the radio work? Well, if golf can work on the radio and if darts can work on the radio, I don't see why not. The problem you've got with snooker on the radio is that it's played in silence. So we can put a microphone to hear the balls being hit. We can have that sound, that lovely sound. They'd have to be a lead commentator and a summariser. They'd have to keep the narrative going. You wouldn't be allowed periods of silence, because with no crowd in the background or periods of silence, that wouldn't sound good on the radio. But in terms of, again, the media in general, there's only one slot per week on national radio devoted to snooker, and that's my slot that I do on TalkSport once a week on Paul Ross's overnight show. Now, I appear on TalkSport once a week. I don't see any reason now, particularly on TalkSport 2, why there couldn't be a weekly snooker and dart show. I think there's easily enough content to keep that going. 1 hour a week. I'm happy to develop the idea and put it together and even present it if they want me to. But I think, in terms of commentary, yes, I do think I'd like to see it tried, because, darts on the radio was first tried in 1999 at the Clash of the Titans match between Phil Taylor and Raymond van Barneveld at the Wembley Conference Centre. That was on the old Talk Radio before it evolved into Talk Sport. Now, TalkSport 2 do wonderful coverage of the PDC World Darts Championship every Christmas now, and that works very well. Fine, great, love it. Let's try it with snooker. I don't see why not.
Well, obviously, we do this podcast. We do it every night from 6 o'clock till 7. We do it an hour a night. So we'd be happy to put it on TalkSport.
Well, yeah. Look. I'm already part of the furniture at TalkSport. I've been with them 18 months now. I'm tempted to pitch it as an idea once a week on TalkSport 2 an hour, and just chew the fat with whoever. I'd happily invite you guys on, certainly. But I do think there is huge potential for this, and there's certain things I'm optimistic about. Right, there's certain things. The way the podcast sphere has improved in a very short space of time, because credit to David Hendon and what he's done with the Snooker Scene podcast. I think he does a wonderful job. But in the space of the last few months, we've had Nick Metcalf and Phil Haig launching the Talking Snooker podcast, which is great. And in recent weeks, we've seen what you guys are doing here. So I'm glad we people are making an effort to give us more choice and more stuff to listen to. And that is very, very welcome indeed. But in terms of national radio, I think there's room for more. But in terms of television, I want to get your guys' thoughts on it. Your thoughts on this. In almost all other sports, there is a very clear divide between the lead commentator and the summariser. And in snooker, that's the case with ITV and with Eurosport. The BBC, from the time they stupidly got rid of Clive, they now fill the commentary box with summarisers. Now, they're two different jobs. the lead commentator can give you stats and context and atmosphere and that, and the ex-player gives you shot analysis.
Yeah.
Now, what the BBC do, and this isn't an insult to any particular individual, but putting two ex-players alongside each other, they can become too talkative. And they also, you don't get that journalistic insight which a Clive Everton or a David Hendon can give you. Or dare I say, look, I've done snooker commentary. I did the English Amateur Finals weekend in 2018. I'd love to expand on that. But there haven't been the opportunities since, for one reason or another. I'd love to expand on that because it was well received. I'm not blowing my own trumpet, but it was well received. I'd like to do more of it. So I think what we're losing in snooker in terms of television now is a lack of respect, particularly on the part of the BBC, for the skill set that people of a journalistic background can bring to the coverage.
I think you're
Can
spot
I
on.
come in there? Can I come in there for a moment?
Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
Well, I wanted to say two words. Clive Everton.
Yeah.
They're butter
Absolutely.
about Clive.
Well, let's think about this now. What year was it that the BBC got rid of Clive? Was it... Now, you can guess what happened there. I'm guessing you know the story, do you?
Yeah.
He was back in the corridor.
Yeah.
At the
corridor,
Masters.
the Masters.
By Graham Fry. He's written about this in some depth. Now, what really went on there, this is when Rodney Walker and co. were still in charge of snooker. And Clive was hammering into Rodney Walker and Dave Richards in Snooker Scene every month. But IMG Productions also had a contract with World Snooker to do their corporate stuff. And they leaned on the BBC, get rid of Clive because he's saying stuff about us in the magazine. So there was politics at work there on the part of the IMG leaning on the BBC. But it was wonderful the way then Clive came back when ITV came on board, because that was a very simple conversation. Barry Hearn was in charge of snooker by then. They just approached Clive and said, do you want to come on board? Bear in mind, Clive had worked for ITV before, back in the 70s and early 80s.
Yeah.
At regional and national. He worked at the ITV regions and the network coverage. And then they said to Clive, okay, you're on board. Who should we ask in as a summariser? And he said, Neil Foltz. And that was that ITV commentary team in the early period when they first came back sorted. Clive Everton, Neil Foltz. And look, Clive's way with words is absolutely brilliant in terms of, and also he knows when to say nothing. Just let the action breathe and do it for itself.
Yeah.
And, you know, he got that calm demeanour he's got. He knows when to speak. He knows when to shut up. He knows when to let the summariser in. And I put Clive in, I know he's a friend of mine. I'm not just saying this for the sake of it. I was saying it before I even knew him. In the very top division of sports commentators, alongside Sir Peter O'Sullivan, Richie Benno, people like that. But I also think we're very fortunate now to have David Hendon, because I think David, you look at the sheer amount of hours he puts in at Eurosport and at ITV. It's quite something, and his research is, well, you know, it's immaculate. His research is immaculate. He, in the modern era now, I think he's doing a fantastic job. I really do.
Marcus, do you put Tony Green in that section of legends?
Sorry, the sound's not great. Can you repeat that, please?
Sorry, do you put Tony Green in that section of legends?
No, I don't.
Okay.
You want me to tell you a bit about Tony Green? Or?
Of course. Yeah.
I'm not a fan, put it that way.
If you want to.
Well, Tony Green, I would say that Tony Green, in terms of what he did at darts, he was very much a BDO stooge at the time of the split. And actually, he also stayed on far too long. You listen to his commentaries in the last few years when he was with the BBC. He also didn't get, one of the reasons I don't like Tony Green is that in terms of when the split happened, he never gave PDC players the acknowledgement he should have done. You know, we'd have like the BDO World Final every year. And he would say, yes, here we go. Yes, Steve Beaton. Now, nothing against Steve. It's not an insult to Steve. He'd say, yes, Steve Beaton, best player in the world. No, he's not. Phil Taylor's the best player in the world. Then Dennis Priestley. Then maybe Steve. But Tony Green used to play these games a lot. I mean, I would think back, you know, BBC darts in the 80s. It was Sid Waddell or Tony Green. And then Sid moved to Sky, and then Tony Green was always paired alongside John Part. And they commentated together for years and years. In terms of darts commentaries, I think that the best darts commentaries I'd ever heard were when you had Sid Waddell, Dave Lanning, John Gwynn, when you had 2 out of 3 in a commentary box on Sky, because Three very, very bright blokes. Sadly, two of them are no longer with us now. Sid and Dave have passed on. John isn't very well at the moment, sadly. I hope John's all right, but he's going through it at the moment. John Gwynn, I'm sorry to say. He's having chemotherapy, and best wishes to him.
Yeah,
But
indeed.
that era from when Sky started, because Sid, Dave, and John, three very different blokes, but three very, very bright blokes, and they all brought a different dynamic into the Sky commentary team. And when they were bouncing off each other at the darts, not only were they very bright, but it was also absolutely hilarious.
It was.
I think that's part of comedy. You have to have a little bit of humor and entertainment besides the straight facts Monday play.
You do. And in terms of why that worked so well with Sky in the early years, was that there was a good dynamic between them. There was also lots of light and shade. Sid Waddell, loud, shouty, over the top, very good with the quips and the puns. Dave Lanning, much more level voice, but knew the game inside out. And John Gwynn, a former school teacher who came into sports commentary later in life. But John was and still is, very good at county and local level darts. He was very involved in county darts in the Manchester area. And he brought various life experiences he had into the commentary box. And him and Sid bounced off each other well. And it was just, I think those early years of the PDC, the 1990s into the 2000s, and even starting into the early 2010s a little bit, those three working together on Sky Darts, that was a classic era for commentary. So that's what I put them.
Yeah.
And
But
just to ask you something about racing for a second, horse racing, who do you think is the greatest jockey out of the rivals between Ruby Walsh and McCoy? And have you got a tip for the Grand National?
Right. I would say in terms of looking back now, McCoy, I would put just ahead. No particular reason. I just think looking back at what he achieved over a long period of time, you're not going to get a tip out of me for the Grand National, I'm afraid. It's still a long way off. We don't know who the runners and riders are going to be. And, you get a pin and you put it in a piece of paper when betting on the Grand National. You don't make serious money out of it. And anyone who puts serious bets on it is completely barking mad in my book.
No, I was just going to say, if you had a Canadian dollar, who would you?
Sorry?
So, yeah. Anyway, that's Mike's thing about Canadian dollars, of course.
Yeah, you're very quiet, my friend. I can only just about hear you.
Okay. Well, I think we're nearly done. I just want to say thank you, Marcus, for coming on.
You're very welcome. It's a pleasure.
Fantastic stuff.
You're welcome. And keep up the good work, guys, because like I say, we're in a great era now. We've got the Snooker Scene podcast. We've got what Nick Metcalf and Phil Haig are doing on Talking Snooker. And you guys, you keep getting the guests on here. I hope you get all the big names on here. Get Phil Yates on here and so forth as well. Keep getting the ex-players on. This is wonderful to see. So keep up the good work, guys.
Well,
thanks, Marcus.
We've got Cliff Thorburn coming on next Wednesday.
Wonderful. He's great value. He's a good storyteller. You like him.
Yeah. I don't know how we can get hold of Phil Yates, but I think Dave's going to mention it to him and Joe Johnson for us, so that'll be great.
Oh, that's good. So there's going to be some great guests in the days and weeks ahead. I look forward to it. All right, you take it easy, guys.
Just one more thing.
Thanks, Marcus.
Yeah. Some lock or no lock questions for you. If you want to ask Marcus them, Mike.
I got five quick snap.
Go on.
Okay. Best book you've read.
Best book I've read. Black Farce and Cue Ball Wizards by Clive Everton.
Okay. Favorite sporting event?
My favorite sporting event. I would have to say the Crucible Marathon every year.
Okay. Best debate you've had?
Best debate I've had. Listen to any of my podcasts. I have lively debates all the time.
Okay. And newspaper you're least likely to work for?
The South Wales Echo. You know what? I'm not kidding you, right? Let me just say this. South Wales Echo and their clickbait factory, Wales Online, didn't even mention Doug Mountjoy's passing.
What?
Criminal.
I know. Disgusting, isn't it?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Thanks for being a good sport, Marcus. Appreciate that.
Anyway,
All right, you take it easy, guys. All the best.
Will do.
see you soon.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Aye.
Well, that was very interesting.
That was great. Thank you, Marcus Stead. We had a good hour and a half with him.
Lots to cover there.
It was great. That was a great interview. I thought he was going to do lock or no lock at the end, Mike, but then you changed it up.
I went. So I went with snap questions.
Okay.
I didn't have any new ones, so I just went.
He was wonderful.
Yep.
I just want to say thank you to you two as well for being such great sports, and
Thank you very much, Graham.
some good questions as well.
Yeah, no problem.
Cheers, Scott. Cheers, Mike.
Yep.
And I'll see you tomorrow night.
Yep.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.